مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أخيرا وبعد أشهر من الانتظار بدأ السباق. لا مزيد من جس النبض، لا مزيد من اللجان الاستكشافية، لا مزيد من المشاورات مع الأصدقاء والأسرة. لدينا الآن مرشحون حقيقيون لخلافة باراك أوباما في منصب الرئيس القادم للولايات المتحدة. على الجانب الجمهوري السباق مفتوح على مصراعيه. أعلن 3 مرشحين بالفعل عن ترشحهم، ومن المنتظر أن يعلن 4 أو 5 آخرين كلهم من الرجال. على الجانب الديمقراطي الوضع مختلف جدا. توجد مرشحة واحدة فقط، وربما تكون هناك مرشحة واحدة فقط لنيل ترشيح الحزب، ألا وهي وزيرة الخارجية السابقة والسيناتور السابق والسيدة الأولى السابقة هيلاري كلينتون. لم يحدث أبدا من قبل في التاريخ الأمريكي أن بدأت المنافسة على الرئاسة بهذا الشكل. لمناقشة الأيام الأولى للسباق الرئاسي لعام 2016 يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة المكونة من الخبيرين السياسيين نورمان أورنستين وستيف كليمنز. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting with our panel of political experts for our annual summer talk show. Gentlemen, summers in D.C. are getting hotter. Global warming is no friend, which is not good for D.C., already a pretty hot place. In what way do you think summer and all that heat affects political life in Washington?
I think it makes people a little bit nastier, which is difficult to imagine given the nastiness in our politics right now. But if you step back a little bit, one of the most interesting theories that I think is accurate about Washington is that our politics changed dramatically when air conditioning came in. The South, and Washington was a part of the South, was almost uninhabitable during the summertime. Populations were down. When we got air conditioning so people could live there year-round, the South, which had been a uniformly Democratic region, turned Republican because a lot of older people moved south. They were Republicans. They had grown up before the era of the Depression and transformed the South. Factories moved in with middle managers. And the Northeast and the Midwest, which had been bastions of moderate Republicans, lost them, became more Democratic, and it changed our politics and made it more polarized. So air conditioning made Washington year-round, expanded government, but also changed politics.
I agree with Norm. I was actually going to mention air conditioning, that if we could basically have more heat and less air conditioning, people would go out on their front stoops, including senators and members of the House, and talk a bit and have a lemonade and increase the sort of general goodwill and understanding in Washington. But given that that's not there, I'm not really a coat and tie guy like everyone else here. I'm much more of a West Coast, Silicon Valley or Los Angeles type who'd like to have black t-shirts and move. So maybe the heat will finally give us some reform in the dress code in Congress.
So your next book should have been, how air conditioning destroyed bipartisanship.
It's actually in the book. It's even worse than it looks.
So now the Supreme Court has an interesting model. They close from June until October. Right. Not a bad idea. What would happen if the rest of Washington took the summer off?
Well, in a way, they try very hard to do that and to escape as much as they can and go back and forth. But I think, maybe we would focus the attention to the legislative engine if we took some days away, because then there's so much paralysis in the system, so little done, that you think in an earnest way that giving them more time, requiring them to be here more might help. But maybe if we took days away, shut it down, it might actually help create a greater public understanding about how little these people are really doing on substantive policy issues that matter in citizens' lives.
But they do take August off. They have an August recess. But what would happen is Congress would go away, but the executive branch would not. the court does go away, and basically it would tilt power very significantly towards the executive branch. So at this point, given that the Republicans control Congress, even though Republicans talk all the time about how they want government to be smaller, I think you'd find the Democrats saying, why don't you take the entire summer off?
Smart answer.
Now, things tend to happen during vacation. I remember very well Saddam invades Kuwait,
right.
August 2nd, August 1st, and Congress was out of session, if I remember correctly.
Right.
What happens when emergencies happen and 435 congressmen, 100 senators are all over the world?
Sometimes they are forced to come back, which they don't like very much. But at other times, it leaves a vacuum, and that vacuum is filled by the president.
I mean, that's what happens with recess appointments. You know, what Norm said is a very smart answer, and I agree with him, is that the executive branch isn't out to be nice to Congress. It's out to take advantage of every nook and cranny that they leave. And so to some degree, recess appointments, undone businesses, the critique of the president over executive authority, those kinds of issues bloom when Congress is away. And so you can look at summer as not only sort of helping Washington to become more green with lots of flowers, but lots more executive action as well.
Interesting. Now let me focus on President Obama for a minute. He likes to split his vacation times between Martha's Vineyard and Hawaii. How does he compare with other presidents in terms of how much time he goes on vacation and what he does on vacation?
You know, I'm not sure I really know. I haven't paid attention to the vacation habits of many of the presidents. Norm?
He's actually spent less time away than many of his predecessors, including George W. Bush, but with a different kind of focus. George W. Bush just loved to go down to his ranch in Texas, ride his bike, clear brush. Bush also liked to go to Camp David on the weekends to unwind and relax. President Obama doesn't particularly like going to Camp David. He spends his weekends more here. You're right that his vacations are split between Hawaii and Martha's Vineyard, but they tend to be a little bit shorter even than, say, Ronald Reagan, who used to go back to Santa Barbara. But, of course, Obama loves, inside and outside his vacations, to play golf. And like previous presidents who play golf, and that includes almost all of his predecessors, he takes a lot of heat and gets a lot of criticism for being on the golf course.
And generally, is he in the pack in terms of amount of vacation time he takes?
He's in the pack, but with a little less time. And I think part of the reason for that has been that their vacations, the Obamas, have to be in sync with the daughters' school schedules. And, you know, it's not very many presidents. President Clinton had it with Chelsea when she was younger, but the Bush girls were older and already ready for college. These are young children, and so you don't go away when the kids are still in school.
I think what's one of the interesting distinctions between President Obama and other presidents, despite the amount of time, which I just don't know, is President Obama is perceived to be a rather insulated, self-insulated guy, someone who does not, so he may play golf, he may play basketball with the closest of his friends that go way back. Bill Clinton used to import people from all over, whether he was in the White House, whether he was away. He was someone who thrived over tons of people engagement that he would bring in. I think George W. Bush, when he went down to the ranch, would have big gatherings of people that would come in. So what is interesting to me, more than the time issue, is that President Obama remains relatively insulated and distant from people. And most other presidents I can think of, from Reagan to George H.W. Bush to George W. Bush, and particularly Bill Clinton, had, when they were at Camp David, when they were traveling and having their fun time, they had lots and lots of people around them all the time.
So what do you think most Americans look for in a president? The model, on the one hand, of the hardworking, always at his desk, doing the work for the American people, or the guy who kicks back, takes some time off, takes a vacation, a regular guy, or as Hillary Clinton would have said, an everyday American? Which model, on balance, do Americans prefer?
Well, you know, what happens with every president is whenever they take time off, their political opponents criticize them for taking time off and not being on the job. Of course, presidents are on the job 24 hours a day. There isn't a day when you don't have briefings or other kinds of issues. most Americans understand, and this goes back to President Eisenhower being criticized roundly for all the golf that he played, they understand that you need a little downtime. And it rarely does it hurt a president if you're off on a vacation, as long as there is the sense that you're keeping tabs with what's going on. The problems don't emerge when you have a vacation. The problems emerge when you are, as with George W. Bush very briefly, after 9/11, when it looks like you're just not in touch with what's going on, when you seem to be clueless about what's happening, when you're flying over Katrina and don't stop to be engaged. If you're engaged when the crisis occurs, you're okay with vacation.
Right, I think that's absolutely right. I think Americans like to see hardworking leaders who have fun in their jobs. They also like to see presidents who walk their own dogs.
Okay. On that note, we'll be back in a moment, and I'm going to ask our guests not who vacations the best or the most in Washington, but who are the hardest working public servants that they've come across in their experience here in just a minute. Again, my panelists are Norman Ornstein. Sitting to his left is Steve Clemons. So, gentlemen, we just spoke a minute ago about what Americans expect from their president, hardworking, vacation. How might that stereotype change if we have a woman in the White House? Norm?
I don't think it'll change much at all. I think the expectation is going to be that if there is a woman in the White House, that she works just as hard as any man would, and that it's not going to affect the way in which she makes decisions or the decisions that she makes. For if it's Hillary Clinton, you know, the challenge is going to be a skeptical press corps that has something that's plagued both Clintons since they entered national life, and relentless political attacks from their opposition. How she handles those, and whether she handles them in a way that will be judged differently for a woman, because women who fight back are often accused of being shrill, where men are tenacious, is going to be a bigger challenge than whether she works hard.
I have a slightly different view in the sense that I think if Hillary Clinton or another woman were elected president, I think there's going to be more pressure on them to show that that makes a substantive difference in women being at the table, defining the rules by which work happens. So one of the biggest articles in the history of The Atlantic was one by Anne-Marie Slaughter called "Why Women Still Can't Have It All." And the big idea behind it is that if women were helping to decide the rules, it wouldn't be a demerit if you took time for your child, or that you managed your child responsibilities in a different way. They would be seen as a natural way, and you would suffer no competitive demerit versus men in that position. So Hillary will be a grandmother, and I think she's going to be expected to show how she would modify the rules in a proactive way to try to create an echo effect in the broader economy.
Interesting. All right, let's shift gears for a second. Hardest working people you've come across in Washington. Steve?
Well, you know, the people that I've always been the most intrigued with in the DC scene are the ones that are the smartest, the best, and never get any credit. And they are in Congress. They are in the Congressional Research Service, and they are in the Legislative Council office. These are the people who, when Ted Cruz and Rand Paul and this senator and that senator take credit, most of the legislative bills and writing have been done by very hard-working legislative staff in a nondescript office that services every office in the building, or every office in the Congress. And the Congressional Research Service are people who understand the history, the context of legislation, and do extraordinary amounts of research. So they are basically the gnomes in the background doing all the real work, and I think they don't get enough credit.
All right, Congressional Research Service. Very good.
Steve has a very good point there. I would say there is a very widespread stereotype out in America that bureaucrats are lazy, that they get there precisely at 9 o'clock, leave at 5, mostly sit around eating lunch, doing nothing. The fact is that most federal workers, and that goes from the lowest level all the way up through cabinet officers and White House staff, as well as the congressional staff, work far more punishing hours under greater pressure than most people I know in the private sector, including at the CEO level. They work long hours and tough hours, and if I were to single out one person right now, it would be John Koskinen, who is the head of the Internal Revenue Service, an agency which is deeply embattled, has seen terrible budget cuts, and in tax season has been trying to keep an agency where morale is low, performing for the American public. He's a genuine American hero.
Okay, very good. John Koskinen of the Internal Revenue Service. So now let me ask you a different question. Politicians who don't take themselves too seriously, politicians who know how to have a good time, politicians who know that they're here only temporarily at the whim of their voters. Who rises to the top of this list for you?
You know, the first person that I would pick, who's now left Congress, is Barney Frank, who's just written a marvelous autobiography. Barney was a very serious legislator, but also with a great sense of humor and some perspective on the limits of what he could do. Another would be John McCain, who sometimes goes to the other extreme and becomes way too intense, but otherwise has a good sense of humor and some perspective on his own life. And a third would be my friend Al Franken, who of course was an award-winning satirist with Saturday Night Live and his own radio show and written many books, and now is in the Senate. Very hardworking, but has the perspective that comedy will bring to you.
I was going to pick Al Franken because I think that he's, you know, he's a good friend, but he's also someone who understands how to kind of keep a balance. Some of the people that most reflect this don't take it so seriously, or do take it seriously, but don't get lost in visions of great political power and drama, but take their jobs seriously, but still have fun. One is my former boss, Senator Jeff Bingaman, who retired a few years ago, who was in for 30 years, but he was a great craftsman, but he just I mean, he hated going to dinners with folks and wouldn't do this. He would go make dinner for his son. He just had, and had a very wry New Mexico wit, which he brought to a lot of these encounters. And I think that class of person who thought they were there to do good for the country, but yet not get lost in presidential drama and great sweeps of ambition is something that we see and is more rare today than it used to be.
Now, you are both journalists of sorts. You also are in the think tank world, but you're both journalists. What's the protocol in Washington? Do journalists vacation with politicians? Do they socialize with politicians? Where are the lines here? What's your experience?
I don't think there are any lines, and it's changed in a couple of ways, though. You know, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, where we didn't have television talk shows, op-ed pages in the same way, but even so, the most prominent journalists were the closest friends of important politicians, gave them advice, vacationed with them all the time. The best example, Ben Bradley, the longtime editor of the Washington Post, who might have been one of the 2 or 3 closest friends of John F. Kennedy. The same was true of other major journalists at the time. Then we went through an era where you were supposed to be more objective. But now we're back to a point where the line between an opinion writer and a reporter has been completely blurred. People write news stories, but also write opinion columns. They go on talk shows where the idea is to be very opinionated, and that means you ally yourself with politicians and you become friends with them. So we don't have any lines anymore over objective journalism and distance from political figures.
I think that's largely right. I think that however, that the most serious journals of opinion, the New York Times or the Post or the Atlantic, you need to have some calculus if you're going to socialize and spend time. For instance, Vice President Biden most summers has a big party at his house called the Summer Boardwalk, and people bring their children, and Joe Biden runs around with a water gun shooting, you know, the children gathering. I mean, it's a real fun thing for journalists. It's definitely corrupting unless you know that the next day you've got to take Joe Biden and the administration on for various things. If you begin to trade your credibility as a commentator or even in your opinion for either access or to those special moments, or to go out on a boat with a senator here and there or something like that, then you're really giving away your own credibility and it won't last. So while I agree the lines have become very blurred, I think you have to have an internal line, which I keep, to maintain credibility.
And so just lastly, gentlemen, any major summer plans?
My summer plans are to spend it on the eastern shore, as much of it as I can.
The eastern shore of Maryland.
Yeah, eastern shore of Maryland, catching. I like to hang a chicken neck off a string and try and catch crabs.
Okay.
I have no significant summer plans. At the moment, I'm taking it day by day.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, wishing you both a restful summer.
The same.
Thank you. Same to you, Rob.
Thank you. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول كيف يختار الحزبان المرشحين للبيت الأبيض، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.